Sewing of a kameez with lining. In the previous session, we cut the fabric pieces and lining pieces for a kameez. We will now sew the fabric pieces together. At the end of the session, you will be able to sew the fabric pieces for a kameez with lining. Let's first familiarize with the tools and materials required for sewing a kameez with lining. They are cut out fabric pieces, cut lining fabric piece, matching thread, sewing machine, shears, a pair of small scissors, measuring tape, and iron box. Now let's see how to sew the fabric pieces for a kameez with lining. We will first sew the lining piece to the front side of the kameez. Take the lining piece and place the right side of the cut front piece of the kameez over it. We will stitch along the neckline with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Cut the excess portions of the lining piece along the neckline. Make small cuts along the seam allowance. Turn the fabric over to the right side. Press along the seam line. We will now do a top stitched seam along the neckline. Next, we will cut the excess portions of the lining fabric at the shoulder and armholes. Repeat the same to attach the lining piece to the cut back piece of the kameez. Next, we will sew the sleeves to the lining piece. For this, place the lining piece over the right side of the sleeve. Now stitch along the width of the sleeve with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Turn the fabric over and press along the seam line. Now we will do a top stitched seam along the seam line. Cut out the excess portions of the lining piece. Repeat the same for the other sleeve also. We will now sew the front and back piece of the kameez together. Place the right sides of the front and back pieces of the kameez together. Place the shoulder seams together and bring the lining piece of the back around the neck opening to the front. We will now sew all the 4 layers together along the shoulder seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Repeat the same for the other shoulder seam also. Now turn the fabric over to the right side. We will now do a top stitch seam along the shoulder seam. Cut out the excess portions of the lining piece around the armholes of the back piece. We have finished the shoulder seams and the neck of the kameez. Next, we will sew the sleeves to the kameez. Take the sleeve and place the curved portion of the sleeve to the front armhole and the rounded portion to the back armhole. We will stitch the right side of the sleeve with the right side of the kameez. We will sew the middle of the sleeve to the shoulder seam. Now stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We will now stitch the other part of the sleeve also. Repeat the same for the other sleeve also. Next, we will sew the sides of this kameez. We will begin sewing from here, matching the 2 parts of the sleeve and give a shape in this part. we will sew till the slit mark. We will make a small mark here to identify it. Repeat the same for the other side also. Next, we will sew the bottom hem for the kameez. Fold the lining piece on the front side ½ inch over to the wrong side and sew. We will join the lining piece at the back with the back piece of the kameez. For that, we will fold them over a ¼ inch and then a ½ inch. Sew a double folded hem. Again, top stitch close to the fold of the hem. Ensure both rows of stitches are parallel. Cut off the excess lining fabric. Next, we will sew the slit for the kameez. For that, we will make a cut slightly away from the slit mark. Cut all the layers of fabric. We will fold the top 2 layers of fabric and the bottom 2 layers of fabric. Now start stitching from one end and move to the other end. Repeat the same for the other side also. Again, top stitch close to the fold. Now we will do some shaping on the sides so that the garment fits the person properly. Turn the kameez inside out. As per our body measurements, the chest circumference is 35 inches. Adding 3 inches of wearing ease gives us a total of 38 inches. But the chest circumference here is approximately 20.5 inches on one side, which means that the total chest circumference is 41 inches. We will need to reduce a total of 3 inches. So we will mark 3 by 4 inch inwards on the right side. Make a few more marks below it also. Repeat the same on the left side of the kameez also. Join the marks made. We will now stitch the seam along this line. Also end with a reverse stitch. Repeat the same on the other side also. We have shaped both sides of the kameez. Now let's iron the kameez to give it a professional look. It is very important to verify the various aspects of quality of the finished product. So let's do a quality check to ensure that our kameez is of good quality. Check if the narrow double folded hem at the neck opening is clean and the top stitch is neatly done. Check if the narrow double folded hem at the armhole is clean. Check if the sleeve hem is clean. Now check if the side seams are even and parallel. Check if the hem at the slit are even and parallel. Ensure that the bottom hem and the side seam joining is neat. Finally, see if the product has been ironed properly. In this session, we have learned how to sew the fabric pieces for a kameez with lining. Before we conclude, let's take a look at the key points involved in sewing a kameez with lining. Step 1. Sew the lining piece to the front and back side of the kameez. Step 2. Sew the sleeves to the lining piece. Step 3. Sew the shoulder seams and the neck of the kameez. Step 4. Sew the sleeves to the kameez. Step 5. Sew the side seams of the kameez. Step 6. Sew the bottom hem and slit of the kameez. Step 7. Shape the kameez at the sides. Step 8. Check the quality of the finished product. With that, we have come to the end of the session.